Well, hi, welcome to episode 44 of Lean Whiskey. I'm Mark Graban, and we're joined by.
I'm Jamie Flinchbaugh. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Jamie. Halfway through January here. Larry David says it's too late in the year to say Happy New Year, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Sure. Well, uh, it's always a first conversation where it's the Happy New Year, and should you still say that in February? Probably not, but I think there's plenty of people still adjusting. We're only a couple weeks in.
Yeah, and Larry David dragged out a whole episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm about how late was too late. It's kind of nitpicky little issue, what makes that show great. But I think what makes this show fun is that we talk about a lot of different things. So here is the rundown of what we're talking about today. This is a recent Kaizen, if you will, not to leave you wondering and guessing what's on the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about old bottles of whiskey, what we're drinking tonight, and then I think we'll have time for two in the news topics. One, maybe on the lighter side, people talk about New Year's resolutions, and then we're also going to talk about inspections at Boeing. More inspections, will that help? And then we're going to have a couple of quick fun questions about football at the end. So that's what's on tap. We do plan these out, even if it.
Yeah, so this should prove it, right? For those that wonder if we just talk about whatever comes to our minds, hey, we said we had a plan at the beginning, and if we don't follow the plan, then call us on it. But I think we will.
So Jamie had the idea of this first topic, old bottles. Kind of tell us what prompted that, Jamie.
Yeah, so there was an auction, an estate auction of, I'll say, a family friend, nobody I know directly, um, who was really quite the collector of antique stuff, particularly York County, where I grew up. And I looked through it for a little bit, and there was a still filled bottle of whiskey um, from Welsh and Company. And you could tell that there was some evaporation from it. There were no rules back then, so you don't know if they bought barrels or if they distilled it. But it was a bottle of whiskey produced in York County, certainly 150 years ago.
Wow.
It doesn't have a year on it, but it's quite old. So I think we briefly toyed with the idea of going in for auction on it.
Thought about it.
Thought about it. It was an interesting idea. I certainly watched the bottle through auction, but it took over $900 to bring home. Yeah, so that's a pretty price for whiskey if A, you're not going to drink it, and B, you don't even know really anything about it. So
Yeah.
heck, it's a hefty price to pay for a bottle of whiskey that is prized and well known, and it's taken care of. Let alone this.
Because I tried just searching Google and couldn't really find anything about the company, or I think it's too old to have any sort of information about it.
Right, right, and Pennsylvania was the one of the distilling centers in the United States way back when. So no surprise that there was some local stuff. And I'm really curious. We will have no idea if the person who bought it plans to store it even longer as a historical piece, or plans to open it out of deep curiosity.
Yeah, I mean it's a risk either way, right? Is somebody buying it for a collection? Are they hoping to maybe flip it or resell it someday? Are they willing to drive it? I mean, you drew kind of a parallel to cars.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Porsche fan, and as Jerry Seinfeld says, whoever has the lowest mileage Porsche 911 when they die loses. And his point is they're meant to be driven, right? Don't leave it in the garage. But as soon as you drive it, it's also worthless. So, Star Wars figures in a box, worth more. Play with it. It's a toy.
Yeah.
Whiskey meant to be consumed. worth more left in the bottle. So, um, it was, I think it's important to note, it probably wasn't very good whiskey to begin with. They weren't really known from a manufacturing technique to make great whiskey back then. Um, and, to really know that it's been cared for at least 150 years, stayed out of heat, stayed out of sunlight, very unlikely.
Yeah. Now, when you were in town, we went to a place nearby in Covington, Kentucky, Revival Bottle Shop. Do you remember the oldest thing that you sampled when we were there? Because it's this place that buys and sells old bottles, and quite often has them opened up where they're selling them by the half ounce pour.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was the 70s or the 60s. I think it's 60s Jim Beam, maybe.
That
Um,
sounds right.
yeah, but obviously this person, the owner has to know enough to know how to take that risk,
Mm-hmm.
and he also likes to share what happens to an old bottle that wasn't taken care of, right? With a
that,
little sniff.
there's one that smells like your grandparents' musty basement.
Yeah. So I don't know how many bottles he's opened only to find out he got not necessarily deliberately manipulated, but somebody brought him a bad bottle because they didn't know and they didn't know how to store.
Yeah.
But you see this even online. People are like, "Hey, I found this in my grandparents' closet," and it's Ballantines, right? But it's a really old bottle.
Well, so it's funny that you mentioned Ballantines, because at Revival Bottle Shop, they do a pretty cool thing there where if you happen to order something and it finishes off the bottle, they'll generally offer to let you take the bottle home, because sometimes it's kind of a museum looking piece, even though it's empty. And so I'm going to hold up for the camera. Those who are just listening can't see it. This is a Ballantines. They could only date it as precisely as the 1940s or 50s
Okay.
era. It tasted fine. Like, it certainly wasn't spoiled. It wasn't the greatest thing I'd ever tasted, but you can also tell from part of the era that it's got kind of the royal seal on here, and it's by appointment to the late Queen Victoria and the late King Edward the Seventh.
Nice.
So this was probably right after Queen Elizabeth had been what's the word?
Crown.
Crowned.
I don't know if that's right, but works.
Made queen. Coronated.
Coronation. There you go.
But she became queen anyway. History lesson for another day. But it's interesting to look at these bottles. But speaking of London, there was a hotel bar in London that had a Prohibition era medicinal bottle of bourbon available for the taste. And it was certainly cool to look at. They let me hold the bottle and kind of check it out. And they might have even let me take a smell, but it seemed like it was a couple $100. And so it was too risky. I didn't want the bragging rights of it
That's really, as they say, for the gram, right? That's just to show everybody that you did it, but that's a lot for just curiosity, because it's probably, again, not that great. But and there's got to be bottles around here, but all Prohibition era whiskey bourbon was medicinal by legal definition, but that's probably about it. So but I love the Revival Bottle Shop. I wish I had something like that near me. It's a super cool idea, but obviously he has to have people bringing bottles in to sell, and you're more likely to experience that in Kentucky than you are in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So hope you can get back here soon, Jamie.
Yep, that's the goal. So so we did not buy that bottle. I did bid on a watch that I was looking at, and I thought I could get that for a steal, it might be worth it, but I got outbid, so I think somebody
Yeah.
else had the same idea for a Longines military watch. But on to our whiskey. I think we've been wanting to do this for a while, but finally got around to it and needed to plan it out. But two bottles of the same expression, same distillery, same expression, maybe different years or whatever that might be. So that's what we're both starting off with two pours.
Yeah.
Mine are already in their glasses next to each other. Fortunately, I
Yeah.
remember which one is which. I didn't put labels on it, but shouldn't. Well, that'll be the last time I hold up both at the same time, so I'll remember
Yeah.
which is which. So yeah, fun. What's interesting is the bottles I have are behind me over this shoulder.
Yeah.
It was on camera, and I've had some of both, but I've never had them next to each other. So this is actually the first time I'm trying this as I've done it. So I went with the Knob Creek. Not a terribly hard to find bourbon, at least the 9 year, which is kind of their, I'll say, primary expression, right? If
It
somebody's,
is.
oh, I've had Knob Creek, it's probably what they drank was
Mm-hmm.
the 9 year. And then I also have the 12 year. And fortunately, because this can make a big difference, they're both 100 proof.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like one's a single barrel or anything like that. It's basically, hopefully, pretty much the same thing, just different ages. And by color, I'm only just getting around to the sipping, but by color, they are quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would mix them up if I didn't pay attention to where they are. You can,
That's an interesting experiment of how much difference does 3 years make, as opposed to comparing, say, the 9 and the 18.
right? Yeah, yeah, exactly. But tasting them on the eye, they don't look very different. But tasting it, you definitely get more depth from the 12 year. You get a little more that molasses like rich sweetness than you do in the 9 year. Both good, and I'd have to say you can kind of tell. Yeah, you can tell they're the same expression. Not sure if I could do it blind, but
Yeah.
but they're very similar. But I'd say, yeah, if I was gonna, I don't remember what I paid for either one, so taking price out of the equation, like the 12 year better.
Yeah. Those are both blended from a large enough number of barrels that they're Jim Beam. They're trying to create a consistent taste,
Right.
consistent flavor profile. So you're that is probably very much an apples to apples comparison of what you have there. The Knob Creek brand is probably pretty consistent over time. But even thinking back to the opportunity I had in October to visit Jim Beam and the distillery, and Fred No was talking about how back in the day people thought nothing really should be aged more than 5 or 6 years, and I'm sure that Knob Creek 9 was kind of at the high end of age statements when that brand was released. Now people have that reaction when they hear about like 20 or 23 or 26 year aged bourbons.
Yeah, and to be fair, the ability to control it, the risk you had from fire and other things, even theft. I don't know as much about the history of cooperage, but did you have greater losses through evaporation? Um, and even aftermarket, right? The distribution and care that happened afterwards. I think a lot of people were looking for a good bourbon. They weren't looking for a top shelf bourbon. That just wasn't a thing
Yeah.
back then. So really, why bother? Once it's good enough, why bother?
Yeah.
I think is probably the tone set back then.
Yeah. Well, and then I was going to say, on the topic of Knob Creek, though, I want to give another shout out to a different bourbon bar real close to me It's in Bellevue, Kentucky. It's called Three Spirits Tavern. And the thing that's fantastic, if not a little bit crazy, is on Friday nights. This always struck me as like a Tuesday night promotion to get people in the door. On Friday night, you can do a flight for 60% off the regular pour price. So you'd be nuts to just order a Knob Creek 12 when you can put together a flight. And I did this one night of the 12, 15, and 18, for 60% off what the combined price of those. They probably do 1 ounce pours, I think. So it's fun to compare, the side by side. And like I've heard people say about other bourbons and expressions, the sweet spot's often in the middle. Like I remember the 15 being the clear favorite. The 18 starts tasting really woody.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think there's certainly diminishing returns at best, right? For age, I don't think it's a linear progression, but there can be diminishing returns too, where it just kind of loses its sharpness or whatever that might be, and so never buy the cheapest version, but probably never buy the highest aging. I think that's fair since I already brought it up. I think that's fair for Porsches as well.
Yeah.
Don't buy a base if you're buying a Porsche. Don't buy the base. Buy the S, right? But you don't need to go all the way to the top shelf upgrades on that either.
Does the same thing apply to watches?
No, because there's rarely different versions of the same thing. There are, but often it's hey, do you want the steel or do you want the gold? So it's just a matter of taste rather than what's better. But I'm not a collector. I'm really a gatherer or an accumulator. Collectors buy and sell, and so I'm not a whiskey collector. I don't buy and sell. I buy and consume. So
Right.
So that makes things pretty different in the watch world as well. It's I accumulate. I don't sell.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, for resale, it probably is true. There's probably some truth to that in the watch world as well. So you went a different route with something where there's probably quite a bit of difference. I'm going to guess.
Yeah.
With a Scotch.
So it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison because of the difference in age and finishing. So I didn't have bottles of Knob Creek sitting around. I didn't have the closest I could find, and still keeping close enough to the theme, is 2 different Glen Scotia scotches, which are produced in Campbeltown by Glen Scotia Distillery, which I had a chance to visit 2022. And so I think the color difference is maybe a little more distinct in the bottle.
Yep.
Now I'm holding up and there's lights. But the younger whiskey is the darker color, but that's because the 10-year here is a special release, limited edition, finished in Bordeaux red wine casks. So that more reddish color, similar to what you would see in a sherry finished whiskey. It just tends to be a little bit redder. And this one's almost even probably cask strength, even though I don't see it labeled that way. It's 10 years unpeated, 56.1% ABV. And then the second one is their 18-year classic Campbeltown malt. So this has no special finishing. It's probably 18 years in an ex-bourbon barrel, and it's bottled at 46% ABV. So it's they're both unpeated. I think the wine barrel finish, it could be power of suggestion. It does have a little more sweetness to it.
Sure.
And the 18 years, just more of that very crisp, malty, just classic, what I think really nice unpeated Scotch should taste like.
Yeah.
but not getting woody, because the 18 years in Scotland doesn't have the same effect as 18 years in Kentucky. It's not as aggressively aged and pushed in and out of the barrel.
Well, and they're not using virgin barrels, so the barrels, the temperature changes aren't as big, but also the barrel's not as aggressive, because
Right.
they're looking really for the whiskey to do its own thing, and bourbon is largely about the barrel, not all about the barrel at all, but there's a lot more about the barrel in bourbon. So, but I find 18. If you had to pick my favorite aging statement for Scotch, I'd say 18 is it. I find 15, 18 is sort of my sweet spot. 21 I love, but 21 and up I love, but definitely diminishing returns for the price. And sort of 12 year and down, that's an perfectly fine, but you don't, it doesn't feel quite as special as that 15 to 18. And obviously it depends on distilleries. I find some distilleries reach that peak point sooner. Like I've always believed Dalmore, they're 18 isn't worth it. The 12 to 15s
Mm-hmm.
are a great sweet spot for Dalmore. But yeah, an 18-year-old Glen Scotia, that's right up my alley.
Yeah. Really recommend it. And I think the Campbeltown region is one that people probably haven't heard of as much as Isla or Speyside or Highlands or Lowlands. There's, I believe, only three, without Googling it, only three distilleries in the Campbeltown region.
Okay.
Which is really mostly centered around the town of Campbeltown, right, as opposed to being like out in the country like some of the other distilleries are.
Right. Yeah, and Campbeltown has its own, just like other regions, it definitely has its own distinct style. And I think, probably for the first time Scotch drinker, probably a good place to start. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people start on the Talisters and the Lafroigs, and they probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I maybe start with the Campbeltown type of things like Glen Scotia, which, mm-hmm, again, it's not going to be the average thing you pull off the shelf at a restaurant, but if you want to buy a bottle, start there.
Yeah. All right. So that's what we're drinking, and we're going to continue sipping here. See, we talk a little process.
We talk process.
With the whiskey. All right. But we're going to talk about a couple things that were in the news.
Yeah, so on a lot of people's minds right now, they might notice that we're not practicing dry January, right, which is kind of interestingly, dry January is like a New Year's resolution that you only plan to last a month on, and it really is almost meant to imply that you've had too much in December. So we're not doing that. But we are going to talk about resolutions and their cousin, the goal.
Yeah.
The goal or objective. So you had found a fun, we're going to include it in the show notes for those that follow along with show notes, a fun NPR bit where NPR was talking to actual people about New Year's resolutions that didn't even last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so whether it's a New Year's resolution and very personal, whether it's a New Year's resolution that's more of a professional goal, or it's a company goal or a team goal that you're setting, fundamentally it's all the same thing, right? Yeah. We're staking a claim on an aspiration and then going after it. But resolutions are famously poorly executed, which is why gym memberships make you sign up for a year.
Right.
And nobody can find a set of weights in the gym because everything's occupied for about 2 weeks. Yeah. And then people stop going and it all disappears. So that's pretty common. So I personally have never been much of a resolution person. Um, because a resolution to me is just an intent,
Mm-hmm.
and there's often very little plan behind it. Um, so, so I generally don't set resolutions, but I will set goals, at least most
Mm-hmm.
years, on all sorts of different fronts.
Yeah.
So, do you do one, both, or the or combination?
Well, I mean, there's times when I've had resolutions that have popped up mid-year because I decided I needed to make some sort of change. I mean, I think January is a natural time to reflect at the end of the year, think a little bit about starting or strengthening habits. So, I mean, in January, first off, we talked about the gym. This is an ongoing thing I should be focused on. Doing yoga every day for 30 minutes. That's been really good for my lower back and so there's positive reinforcement to do that. And then to get to the gym and sweat, and to do that nearly every day. So again, those should be just good habits, definitely not a January thing, but maybe this will become a thing like dry January. And, I applaud or appreciate anybody who is doing that. I decided to try to do a sugar-free January, which, it's the general thing that I should be doing, is avoiding sugar and not overdoing it. But I think one reflection, maybe this is helpful for others. I think somewhere around the 4th or the 5th, we were at an event somewhere and I had something small that had sugar in it. So I certainly wasn't going to shame myself or spend too much time feeling bad about it. I think just acknowledging, all right, that was a little detour. Like that was no reason to say, well, I give up the resolution and I'm going to go drink a giant milkshake tomorrow.
Yeah. But that is one of the primary failure modes in resolutions is many of them are rather extreme,
Yeah.
meaning they're beyond anything you've ever done before and beyond what's sustainable and reasonable, right? So you found yourself, 4 days in having sugar, right? Because literally going a whole month without sugar, you almost have to live like a hermit and
Yeah.
plan your meals for the whole month in order to truly achieve that. And so, a lot of resolutions like, hey, I haven't gone to the gym for 3 months. And then boom, on January 1st, I'm going to start going every day. It's too dramatic, right? And so people set resolutions that are overly ambitious and binary, right?
Yeah.
You either achieve it or you don't. And then when it's clear you're not going to achieve it, yeah, out it goes, right? You just pop off because you have no chance of actually achieving, like you have no chance of achieving sugar-free January.
Well,
So,
but by striving for that, I'm closer to sugar-free
right.
than,
Which,
and I would have been otherwise. But I always say, I mean, I'm better at not bringing stuff home from the grocery store or not ordering it at the restaurant. But if it's in front of me and someone else has ordered it, or there's, if it's kind of a social thing, like, well, I'm not going to be rude. Okay. I have less self-control if you put the sweets right in front of me. So I guess the don't buy it strategy helps. But yeah, I mean, the NPR piece talked about what you were saying, Jamie, of people taking too big of a leap. I mean, somebody could literally hurt themselves if they go to the gym and work out too hard, too long that first time, or they're going to be too sore, and then there's disincentive to go. But they, in that NPR piece, also kind of talked about what I've heard Kaizen experts talk about, the power of baby steps
yes.
to build new habits. I think back to the 2 times I interviewed in my Lean podcast, Robert Moore, who's a psychologist from UCLA. He's written 2 books about Kaizen, and he really, really emphasizes the baby steps approach. To summarize real quick, if somebody really hasn't been exercising, and in their mind, exercising means working out for an hour, that's going to feel intimidating. They're far less likely to go and do it. And what Dr. Moore brings people through is the baby steps of, he'll literally tell patients, all right, you're watching TV on the couch, probably a realistic scenario. Commercial comes on, get up and walk in place for the length of a commercial. That's 30 seconds of walking in place. Now, you're not going to get healthy only doing that. But you found people don't find that intimidating. They're like, oh, I can do that. Then they start. Then it's 2 commercials. Then it's the entire commercial break. And you're far more likely. I think it's a good change management strategy for yourself or others.
And I think that's sort of the lean thinking applied to New Year's resolutions, which is you have to think about the how along with the what, right? So too many resolutions are just outcome based, and it's just about the what, but what's the how behind it, right? So as an example, in my goal setting, I start to write out the how I'm going to achieve it, and I think there's 2 parts of this. One is begin with how, right? Have a plan. So part of my, I'll say, fitness goal and plan, the how, is I'm calendaring what I'm going to do each day. Right? So I'm not just saying, oh, I'm going to exercise every day, and then I wake up and I'm like, I don't know what I want to do, and I think about it for 40 minutes and then I run out of time. So I have a calendar. I'm starting to calendar on my calendar. I'm going to do yoga this morning, and tomorrow it's a walk, and then it's a hike, and it's this and that. But it's calendar, and that's the beginning of the how. The second part is building on it, right? When so my goal has essentially how many incidents of at least a 20-minute workout do I have in the first quarter. So I have a goal, I have a tracking, and I have a plan. And then I'll set a Q2 goal, which will build on that. And so I think the combination of paying attention to the how, but also not trying to, plan out a journey that you've never been on, do it in stages, right? There's no need to figure out where you need to be December 31st. Figure out where you need to be in a few weeks. Figure out where you need to be in a few days. Figure out where you need to be in a couple months, and then adjust from there. And that's much closer to us, I'll say, a lean thinking approach to goals and resolutions.
Yeah. So you could make a connection to strategy deployment. What are the core measures you're trying to impact? And then what are the breakthrough initiatives or other improvements actually reach the goals, so that your annual goals aren't just hopes and dreams? Like if some health system said, hey, our goal this year is to reduce patient harm by 50%. Okay, you better have a plan.
Better have a plan. And that plan doesn't have to be all the answers, right?
Sure.
So, especially if it's a wildly, I'll say, ill-defined, open-ended problem, it's like your first steps might be a combination of progress and more learning. Right? Where can we make, what do we know now that we can start to make progress on? And what learning do we need to do in order to make the next stages of progress? And that's sort of phase 1, right? And then, okay, we've learned some stuff and we've made some progress. So we feel good about that. We can build on that. And we've learned these things so we can build the next actions. And that's, especially for goals and resolutions, there's sort of a premise where you don't know how to be successful at it. That's why you've bothered to set this goal.
Yeah.
If you already knew, just do it. Like, just do what you need to do. But there's sort of a premise, especially with our work goals and our business goals, that we don't know everything we need to do. So, don't pretend, I'm gonna do these steps and then magically the next steps will appear. What learning also has to occur, right? So that could be research, that could be paying attention to your first steps, right? So I'm looking at, because I'm also writing down on my calendar, not just how often I'm exercising, but what I'm doing, I can find the right rhythm, right? And, for example, I have really bad knees. For those that are ever around me, they find that out pretty quickly. Really bad. My knees are twice as, based on mileage, they're twice as old as I am. So, I can't do, a lot of weights or a lot of walking or anything like that, multiple days in a row. So what's the right balance? Well, I have to learn that. I can't just assume that. So I'll learn that by paying attention to how the work is going on. So when we build our goals, resolutions, whatever we want to call them, with a combination of action steps for progress and learning steps for figuring out the next action steps, we're much more likely to be successful. Because we
Mm-hmm.
just have to admit we don't know everything we need to know to
Mm-hmm.
achieve what we set out to do.
Yeah, I like that. So, I mean, for you, do you set what people call a SMART goal? I'm trying to remember. Do you have better recall on what the 5 letters
Well,
of
so here's a
SMART?
fun little trick.
Yes.
If people want to start Googling this, is they aren't consistent. There's a bunch of different
Oh,
versions. And so, of course, if there's a bunch of different versions, then it's almost meaningless, right? But most of the versions, many of the versions, the most popular set is specific, measurable, um, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Now, my argument is that if you get, so I talk about MT goals. If you get measurable and time bound, aren't you by definition specific? And
sure.
so by definition, you figure out the right measure and you put a clock on it. It's by definition specific at that
Yeah.
point. Um, if you're setting irrelevant goals, then we need to have a different conversation. I don't think we need a reminder for that.
Yeah.
And then achievable is interesting because I actually don't think all our goals. I think
I, mm,
each goal should be achievable, but our set of goals should be ambitious. And what I mean by that is, yeah, we're gonna hit 9 out of our 12 goals, whatever the number is. And some we're gonna fall short on, and some we're gonna succeed. We may not know which ones,
mm-hmm.
um, but but if we're always achieving our goals, did we push ourselves at all?
Right. I mean, I think there's got to be a balance here. I mean, achievable is a judgment call, and I think there's also the element of how much fear is there? Fear of not achieving what we've deemed achievable, because I think there's a balancing act. We don't do ourselves any favors. I see a lot of healthcare organizations. They set a goal. We're going to perform 2 or 3% better than last year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then my statistical brain says, like, well, that's clearly in the realm of noise in the metric there. I mean, 2% is probably, for most measures, like statistically not a meaningful difference.
Right.
So then, there's people who push back on, the Paul O'Neill type goal of 0 defects, of saying, oh, well, that's not achievable, therefore it's demoralizing. And, I think there's a middle ground. And when you celebrate the progress, like I think, for example, good health systems that were doing a lot of rapid improvement events, AKA Kaizen events, and they were taught and pushed to have, a 50% improvement goal. Well, I went to some of those report outs. If someone achieved 42% improvement, that got huge applause. And, people weren't getting chewed out for not hitting the 50. But setting the goal of 50 compared to a goal of 5 really did stretch people's thinking. And let's go try things that are a little bit more radically different. So I think, you got to find a balance. But within a team, I'm sure you'd have a mix of opinions of what people think is achievable.
Yeah, and I think we sometimes separate what we're using to plan and learn and action versus what we're incentivized to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, when we're setting goals in a corporate setting, should any of those goals have a date of December 31st? Probably not, because we're not, very few companies make a lot of progress between Thanksgiving and the end of the year. Very few, right?
Yeah.
So if you haven't hit the goal by mid-November, are you suddenly going to let's pick up the pace and then get there? So yeah, from a planning standpoint, from an actioning standpoint, we should be thinking about goals. And if all the goals stack up on top of each other, we can't push in all of them at the same time. So some goals should be April, some July, some November. Now, when it comes to performance reviews, then sure, we can use December 31st as the evaluating metric for all of those, but that's a different purpose. That's the evaluation window. That's not how we plan and to achieve the goals. And if we're using that, that date should almost never be December 31st.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, January 1st is a meaningful date for individuals, for organizations. I mean, how many organizations have kind of a lean New Year's resolution of like, okay, well, this year, January, we're really going to do 5S well. And then do they fall off the wagon and come around to next year, January, kind of making the same resolution?
Yeah, I think that can be pretty common. And while the turn of the new year is a time for reflection, I think there can be also some distortion in how we plan, how we think about planning. Right? We can be filled with utter disgust at how the year ended, combined with this blind optimism about what we can do going forward. And I like to say no big decisions should be made in one sitting, and resolutions and goals are the same thing. So I think I have at least two goals that still have an X where the number should be, and my goal, my action is to decide what that number is sometime in February, right? And so the whole point is, yeah, I have a goal. This is my goal, but I just put an X in for what the number is, and I have some steps I need to take to kind of think about what that number really needs to be. I'm already actioning, trying to achieve it, even though I don't know what X is, but I haven't written down X until I kind of took some learning steps to figure out what I need to do. So to me, I think of a goal setting process taking place over a period of time, right? So hoshin, kanri, policy deployment, lean strategic thinking, whatever you want to call it. There's this concept of catchball, and this is when we're talking about layers. Is, hey, I'm going to set a goal. I'm going to lay some stuff out about how we achieve it. I'm going to give it to you. You're going to talk about it. You're going to stress test it. You're going to give it back to me, and we're going to make an adjustment. The whole point of that, besides getting alignment, is to kind of slow it down and to think clearly about what it's really going to take. And, I think New Year's goals, New Year's resolutions, goals, personal or team-based, should be the same thing. Let's start writing down what they should be. Let's start putting some meat on the bones. Let's start laying out some actions. Let's refine over a period of weeks, maybe even a couple of months. And that's the normal process. And then I think there's some goals that should say, yeah, set a Q1 goal, and then at the end of Q1, set a Q2 goal, based on how much progress you made, but also what you learned, because you just don't know where you're going to be or what your rate of progress is going to be.
Yeah.
So,
I want to wish everybody well on any resolutions they made, whether it was personal or health or work related. Or I was going to say also maybe people. It'd be interesting if there are any behavioral resolutions in the workplace. Let's say related to psychological safety. I resolved to reward people for speaking up instead of punishing them.
Yeah, and again, if you just have a good intention, that's one thing, but you have a system or a plan, that's going to get you a whole lot further. So yes, we wish everyone all the success, and I'll twist that as, we wish everyone all the required investment to achieve your goals, because that's usually the hard part, and that's where we drop the ball. So invest the time, the energy into figuring it out, putting your plan together, and we wish everyone all the success in doing that.
Yeah, and don't give up if you fall short one day. Get back into it. 1
day, 1 month, 1 year has very little to do with your ability to be successful the next time. So, so if it's worth it, learn from it, take the next steps, and move forward.
Yeah.
speaking of making resolutions, there's one company that probably needs a few.
Seems like
Uh,
they're making a few.
Seems like they're making a few.
Shouldn't happen just because of the first of the year, but at Boeing, speaking of in the news, after the January 5th incident with the Alaska Airlines plane, where 737 MAX 9 had a what they call a door plug. That was a new term for me. A door plug basically blew out at 16,000 feet, and thankfully the plane landed safely. Nobody was killed. There were some injuries, I think relatively minor injuries, but it seems like Boeing's New Year's resolution is to do more inspections. So I'm going to give a little bit of a recap of some of this aftermath that's been in the news here this week, and a memo that was published by Boeing on their website. We can link to it in the show notes. Their commercial airplanes president and CEO, Stan Deal, is talking a lot about inspections. I haven't heard anything about mistake proofing or prevention, but just to give a quick recap. Here's their action plan. It includes more quality inspections, planning additional inspections at Boeing and Spirit Aerosystems. That's the separate company formerly part of Boeing that makes the fuselage. So it's one more layer of scrutiny on top of the thousands of inspections performed today. We have, since 2019, we have increased the number of inspectors by 20%. And then they talk about doing more inspections at Spirit, not just the bolts on the door plug, but 50 other points in the build process. And nobody knows yet if Spirit built it wrong to begin with, or if the company that took the door plug out to install the Wi-Fi system, did they not put it back in? But people say ultimately Boeing is still responsible for that. But FAA is going to be doing audits. There's going to be outside assessment of Boeing assembly practices. They are welcoming inspectors from the airlines. And I wonder now if the inspectors are going to be just tripping over each other. How many people can be simultaneously inspecting if those bolts have been tightened properly? I mean, what's your first reaction to some of that, Jamie?
Well, the first thing is that, it takes time to study systems problems and to develop resolutions. So that's, I'll say, I don't want there to be an answer yet. Like, I,
Sure.
I don't, you can't put 200 people on this problem and get to the answer faster. It should be well studied, researched, scientifically, observationally, and we should take our time getting to what really went on. So that's my first reaction. Second is that if we can't get to the root cause, then inspection is at least a stopgap at best, but
Okay.
a stopgap. Um, and so I don't think inspections are inherently bad when we know a system is failing, right?
Right.
So, if traffic lights aren't working, sticking a police officer at the intersection isn't a bad idea, right? We know that the real system is broken, so we're going to put something in place that ensures bad outcomes don't.
Well, you're making me think the risk of trying to mistake proof that by having some barricade that pops up from the ground when the light turns red.
Right.
Society's decided not to mistake proof running the red light because sometimes police and fire need to. And,
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes I think if you can't, or if you haven't figured out how to mistake proof it yet, inspection, like you said, is a stopgap. But inspection, especially if it's done by humans, is imperfect as well. So I wouldn't want to completely hang my hat on more inspections. And if double inspections are good, why not triple inspections? And how many more inspections would make that, not have anything fall through the cracks?
Well, and I think you said inspectors would increase by 20%. And so that, basically says, well, is that all inspections will get 20% more scrutiny? are we going to triple our inspections of door plugs, mathematically decrease our inspections of other things, right?
Yeah.
So, we don't know if this, and this goes back to root cause and systems understanding. We don't know if this is um, a door plug issue, a fuselage issue, or a general assembly issue, or a service issue, right?
Right.
And so, increasing inspectors by 20% at least ensures probably that missing planned inspections is going to be less likely, right? Not don't know if that's
Well,
contributed at all, but just hey, there's never enough resources, and at least we'll do what we plan to do if we have more inspectors.
well, there's doing the inspections, but then some of the discussion from former Boeing people who are involved in legal action because they're filing suits saying they were wrongfully fired for being whistleblowers or speaking up about quality issues. I mean, it gives me flashbacks to 1995 at General Motors, where people would do the inspections and then management would overrule the decision to stop the line because of a quality problem, quantity over quality, or schedule is king, kind of mindsets. Or back at General Motors, literally telling people to not take the time to do the inspections.
Yeah.
Management would roll the dice with quality. And there are people who make accusations around like, well, quality inspectors who are raising issues would get reassigned. It will bring in a contractor, it will bring in another inspector. I mean, there's a whole layer of alleged management decisions that I wouldn't describe as a worker problem. Or like,
Yeah.
not to rant too much, but I read a piece in Slate online website. I know this guy thought he was being funny, but he said something about like, well, I fly a lot and I always figured there's a chance I might die in a crash, but I'm paraphrasing here. But I didn't want it to be because some idiot didn't tighten the bolts. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I mean, it's not some individual idiot. It's not. I mean, it's more complex than that.
Well, and certainly because multiple airlines found the problem, so that by definition is likely not the
Well,
case. And I'd say, I do think compared to that GM in the '80s scenario,
90s. I'm not that old.
'90s, yeah, it was much more common in the '80s, right?
Sure.
The auto industry was heat it, beat it, and ship it. That was just get through. I think it's pretty rare. I'm not saying Boeing isn't guilty of this. I'm saying it's pretty rare that companies today knowingly sacrifice quality for delivery. I think it's pretty well accepted as just an ethos of even good profitability that you will be found out with bad quality. So don't cut that corner. Every one of us can have a bad moment, but I think what used to be like production was there to ship it and quality was there to hold them accountable. I think a lot of that is those days are largely over. But again, there's an exception to everything. Doesn't
Mhm.
mean that this isn't that exception. The other thing is when we start to look at causes, the I don't want to say the vast majority, but the majority of the time, when you have a systematic problem like this, it's not even assembly, it's design. And I haven't heard any, I have not read everything on this, partly by intent.
Mhm.
So like we don't know squat. Like so, right?
Well, I mean, I think the experts are saying for now, it's not a design flaw. It's at some point an assembly defect or a reassembly defect. Because I've heard there are some people saying if you look at the value stream, Spirit Aerosystems, formerly Boeing, assembles the fuselage, which includes the door plug on planes that have the door plug instead of another emergency exit, because they don't have enough seats on the plane to require the emergency exit. It's shipped by rail to Boeing. Now, some have said they take the door plug out to give another access point to do the interior assembly, which sounded credible. You got to put in seats and all this other stuff, and more access points would probably streamline and speed up assembly in a good way, assuming the door plug is then reinstalled back to original specifications. But then there's that the dimension of a different third-party vendor that supposedly takes the completed plane and installs the thing everybody wants, which is Wi-Fi. That company takes the door plug out to do their wiring and installation. So it could be a possibility. Well, I mean, even if Spirit had assembled it and tightened it incorrectly, the door plug wouldn't fly out when it's traveling by rail, probably. And then there's that other company involved, and then Boeing is supposed to do the final sign off. So it's complicated by different companies being in that value stream.
Right. But even from a, I'll call, so we talk about product design and process design, right? So you kind of go, did somebody make lots and lots of mistakes over many aircraft? Or was there a product design or a process design problem, right? And so if there was a process design failure where we're taking out a plug, putting it back in, there's no spec for how to do that, that's a process design problem, right? And so again, looking at how are we doing assembly versus how are we designing the process. Mm-hmm. That's where this is worth taking the time to get to root cause, because something that's happened to this many units is very rarely just random mistakes.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we know how many planes have been affected. They've grounded them and they're inspecting them, I think for good reason, because on the plane in question with the Alaska Airlines flight, they did inspect the right side of the plane door plug, and that had been done properly, right? So this one plane, that one door plug, it could be a one-off freak occurrence, or it could be indicative of a common problem.
Right, but that's where other airlines, like I believe United, have found other loose bolts on the same door plug.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay.
So that's the fact that that's the data that suggests there's a pattern, right? So it's not random variation in assembly.
Right. But then, I mean, while we have, I'll frame it as an unreliable process that's not generating perfect product. I'd rather have the inspections than not. But then it raises a question of, is this a broader standard work issue? Is this a bolt issue? Those are not the only bolts on a plane. Spirit Aerosystems has gotten in a lot of trouble for all kinds of manufacturing defects. It actually got a CEO fired last year. So, yeah, I mean, it just makes me wonder, back to the question of, somebody that would blame an idiot worker. So, well, what about the standardized work? What about the training? What about the supervision? What about the inspection process? What about the culture? I mean, there's so many other factors where some people, I think, would oversimplify and say, well, that person needs to just do their job.
Right.
Well, tightening a bolt is not hard, but if you're under pressure to speed up your work and you're not being listened to, and that suddenly gets more complicated.
Yeah, and that's I think super important around the difference between one-off problems and patterns of problems, and then also the effectiveness of inspections, right? So you can't, if a mistake can happen anywhere in the process, the only way to inspect inequality is to inspect every step in the process, which is a 1-for-1 ratio. Mm-hmm. So we do have an instance where this exists, is in software. There's a concept called extreme programming, where, I'll save all the details, but one person is coding while another person is inspecting real time.
Or some Menlo Innovations, Rich Sheridan, they call it paired programming, which I think is part of the process, right? It's
Part of it, yeah. So they didn't invent any of that, but it's yeah, you're getting, basically one person's on the keystrokes and the other person is there checking the code, looking for errors real time. Now, writing code, you're not following standard work, right? You're creating, so it's very very likely. So it's a combination of very likely to have errors and harder to catch them afterwards. So let's invest two people for every one person's worth of work. By no means are we investing that much in inspection.
Yeah.
And so the only way inspection works is if we either know what to inspect, right? We know where the risks are, and so we're putting our resources where the risks are. Or we're looking at the system itself, which is really what the FAA should be doing, not actually inspecting aircraft, but looking at the system. And neither of those are inherently successful unless we know the root cause. Right? So I'm not going to complain about more inspectors, but it doesn't mean we've contained the problem.
Right. And I'm not going to complain about it, but I will hope and trust that Boeing is also, as much as they've tried to embrace lean, which is all secondhand or third-hand knowledge to me, I hope they're going to dig more into mistake proofing. And I think the talk of inspections might be as much about optics and PR as it is quality. Because I think people don't understand. I mean, it's, you and I and people listening to this are going to understand these nuances of like, well, sure, inspection versus better mistake proofing. And the general public is not clued into that.
No, and to be honest, because this wasn't a fatal accident, we're not going to be talking about this in a year. So just the news cycle isn't, that patient. So,
well, it's fortunate that this happened at 16,000 feet and not 36,000 feet, some say.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And nobody was sitting at that particular spot,
or the middle seat, and that was a pretty full flight, but not those two seats. So,
which is always, that's probably the row I would target. So, it's probably what would happen to me, but
I don't think it was an exit row with your extra leg room for your bad knees.
No. But that's where upgrades come into play.
Yeah.
So, and this isn't making me want to, fly, returning to my old days of flying every week. But yeah, I mean, everybody wants to know, what are you doing? And you can't just say, we're problem solving, right?
Sure.
They want to know that you're doing something now to protect the public, which is interesting because the flights are grounded, right? So adding inspectors isn't likely to say lift the flights being grounded for 737-9s.
Right. Well,
so it's in a lot of ways it's a containment of a problem that's already contained.
In a way, but yeah, there's the existing planes and the future production, and this is Boeing's the 737 in general is their highest volume product by far. The order numbers on the -9 MAX aren't as high. I don't think American Airlines, who I fly, has many of the 737 MAX. But after the previous problems and the two crashes, and I know I'm not alone, and I'm going to start paying attention to, okay, what's the equipment? Where I thought, like, all right, well, the previous problem had been put to bed. But one other thing I was going to bring up, though, to the idea of inspection, as much as lean dogma says inspection is waste, it's part of the waste of defects. I've seen organizations get in trouble by taking that to heart and saying, okay, we'll get rid of our inspections. But because they don't have a capable process that's mistake proofed, defects get to the customer. I'm like, well, that's worse. That's a worse waste.
Yeah.
Than spending more on inspections. And sort of case in point, even though, I mean, I'm with you to say inspection's a stopgap or a short-term countermeasure. This surprises people sometimes when I say, well, look, I've been to Toyota plants in Japan and San Antonio and Kentucky. And what they all have is a big area with lots of bright lights and lots of people called final inspection.
Yeah.
For all the talk about building in quality and mistake proofing and Jidoka and they still have final inspection, because I think rather than falling on dogma, they're being practical and saying, look, we're still not producing perfect quality. Therefore, final inspection is a less harmful waste than letting defects get to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually helped JD Power build their consulting practice to go into automotive manufacturing plants and look at how do you control quality. And I have a model called the 4 loops of quality, which looks at different layers of doing that. But this is also what's wrong with misunderstanding the idea of the 7 types of waste, which is you identify the waste and then you identify the cause of the waste.
Yeah.
But you can't eliminate the waste without eliminating the cause. So inspection is not one of the 7 types of waste, by the way, but it might be wasteful. It's certainly not value added, but it might be necessary unless you've eliminated every defect, right? So
that's my point. It might be necessary.
Might be necessary.
So yeah.
Inventory is the same thing. And it doesn't have 0 inventory until they improve their setup time or their uptime or their lead times or their yields or whatever it might be. Until they improve that, they can't reduce their inventory. So, you see the type of waste and then you go, what's the cause of that waste? And then you go eliminate the cause. You don't just take out the waste.
Yeah.
So that, the waste is a lens to find underlying problems. And that's all it is. And so, yeah, inspection is wasteful, but it's still necessary. It's still important until you can prove to yourself, let alone the FAA or the customers or anybody else, until you can prove to yourself that you can do something absolutely defect-free, especially when it's important, right? And I argue if you have customers, then whatever your work is important. I don't care if you're a marketing agency or you're selling gum or, toothpicks, or it doesn't matter, right? Whatever it is, customer cares. So until you can prove to yourself you can deliver to the customer without a defect, some inspection is always going to be necessary.
Yeah. And I'll give Boeing credit. I haven't heard any talk around, we fired the person who was responsible. I haven't heard any scapegoating. I mean, Dave Calhoun, the CEO, I think in fairly plain language, admitted Boeing's made mistakes, and
Yeah, I think this, as much as an accident does, where half the time with an accident, obviously there's legal concerns with an accident, and nobody wants to claim culpability. This one's a little easier because damage isn't there, and still going to be lawsuits. There already are lawsuits, right?
But there are for physical and emotional trauma,
right? And I don't know if that's warranted. I'm not going to even go there, but yeah, they've basically said it doesn't. We need to figure this out, and I think they seem to be genuinely taking it on the chin, where they acknowledge that this is unacceptable. Their PR instincts may be also kicking in, but I don't think it's disingenuous. I do think it's genuine, but I'm also not sure they have the solution. Not sure they're there yet. Boeing has been doing lean for as long as almost any company in North America, but have they been doing it well? And I don't have a lot of indicators to suggest they are. I think they spent a lot of time on cell design. They spent a lot of time on efficiency. They relied on external consultants forever. I'm not sure they ever truly owned it. And that flip from getting help to we own this, we get this, we're going to drive this. This is part of our DNA. I'm not sure they, as long as they've been on this journey, I'm not sure they ever got there.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between implementing lean tools and doing things on the shop floor and really having more of a broad lean culture that other companies are working toward. So yeah, I mean, what's a bunch of Kaizen events, a bunch of lean tools. They famously set up a moving assembly line for airplanes because, as I've heard it secondhand or third hand, that a consultant pushed them to do that as opposed to pulsing the plane, like moving it at a certain frequency, like continuously, very slowly moving assembly line, which I've heard this is in the realm of rumor that the line only moved continuously when certain executives came to visit. Otherwise, they ran it exactly like the old pulsed line.
Mm-hmm.
So, superficial lean, and like to me, lean is not about moving assembly lines. It's more about culture and leadership and management style, and some companies don't get into that.
And fundamentally, I'll go back to this point, but for a product this complicated, you can't be lean in manufacturing only.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get design there, and I don't know if they've ever really made any efforts there. I don't. There's very little that I've heard about sort of, I'll say, lean product development or just bringing lean into the design culture. Heard lots about their manufacturing, their cells. I once led a American machine tool builders group on a tour at Boeing, asked by the association to do that because Boeing wasn't buying their equipment; they were making their own, and so I did that as a favor to the association. But a lot of their lean efforts has been on manufacturing, and you can only go so far in manufacturing with a product this complex. And so
Yeah.
the fact is, and this is the same news we had when we were doing consulting in automotive plants with JD Power, which is it can help you manufacture better. But if you want to improve quality, let's talk about design.
Yeah. The time will tell. I'm going to be flying on Friday. I don't know if it's going to be a Boeing 737 or an Airbus A320 or 321, but you fly enough and you can't help but think about, like, well, I could die. Odds are really low, right?
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
odds are very, very low,
I
and
mean,
the fact is this happened. It's national news, and yet, how many people died in car accidents today?
I
And
mean,
it's not going to make the news that this did. So,
the drive to the airport is more dangerous.
yeah, no question, right? So, when it comes to airline safety, we're still far from what we experience in automotive safety,
Or
airline
healthcare safety.
or healthcare safety. There we go.
Sorry.
But yeah, I've always paid attention to the aircraft, mostly because it would tell me a lot about my seat and my leg
Right.
room, things like that. But also being an ex-Delta well, I guess still current, I just don't fly very much. But Delta and Northwest loyal customer, watching out for those DC-9 flights was a big part of my life for a while.
To avoid those.
Oh yeah, I've always hated the DC-9 flights.
Yeah. But they always say, I mean, takeoff and landing are the most dangerous parts of a flight. So taking a nonstop flight reduces your risk of I think I learned this from Arnie Barnett
Yes.
from MIT, our professor, statistics professor, and aviation expert. Taking a nonstop flight as opposed to a connection cuts your risk in half.
Right.
One time up, one time down. It's just never occurred to me that you could be sitting there and have just part of the fuselage blow out. And it happened once, I think, at a Hawaiian Airlines flight a long time ago. It happens very, very rarely, but I don't think about that. It's more of like as we're taking off, and I still have the scars of growing up in Detroit when the Northwest Airlines flight crashed on takeoff because the flaps were set incorrectly.
Hmm.
The plane couldn't get enough lift, and it hit a light pole, and it crashed and killed everybody on board. But a very young infant who miraculously survived. But I think of things like that. I cringe on takeoff sometimes. I'm like, are we getting enough lift? But then once you get off the ground, you're like, oh, well, we're great as long as there's not a plane on the runway when we land. But that's the Japan Haneda Airport incident that is now not in the news so much because of the Boeing incident.
Right.
Different human factors, different systemic factors.
But it's still a safe way to fly, a safe way to travel. It may be a frustrating way to travel these days, which is really why I avoid it. But it is still a very safe way to travel. Yeah. So,
well, if you weren't driving the Kentucky and back, we wouldn't get chances to hang out in person.
That's true. Yeah,
that's good too.
And those flights were always connections, so I had more chances to, not as many chances as I have at driving through the West Virginia mountains. But yeah. All right, well, we haven't solved it today, no. But neither have they. But we can trust for now that they will take their time, get it right, and make this problem go away. But there certainly seems to be some other underlying issues that are going to take a little more time.
Yeah, well, and I'll note we recorded this on Tuesday the 16th, and we'll probably release it as we tend to do on a Friday, probably the 19th. So if things have changed in between, we apologize for being a couple of days out of date.
Sure. And while we're picking aircraft, let's remember that Spirit Aerosystems also supplies Airbus. So plenty of risk all around, plenty of safety all around.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to end up with a couple of closing fun questions that are football related. So first off, I'll pose this question: who are you pulling for in the NFL playoffs? We've gotten through what they now call Super Wild Card Weekend.
Super Wild Card Weekend, which just means one team has a bye, or just two technically, but
two teams, one in each conference.
One in each conference, but yeah, I don't know why they need names. It's just playoffs. The playoffs have started. Just call it what it is. So I'm going to go with the line. Now, first of all, those that know me know I'm not a big football fan. I've watched more soccer in January than I've watched football all year. So, I'm not a deep football fan, but I lived in Detroit long enough. I got to know enough of the spirit of Detroit, and that I'm absolutely pulling for the Lions.
Yeah.
I think the Eminem opening how Detroit needs this is great. Now I'm a Steelers fan, so if you ask me for my team, it's the Steelers. But honestly, if they were still in it, which they're not, I just didn't think this was their year. I didn't think they just. I was shocked that they made the playoffs. I don't think they deserved it, but they squeaked into the playoffs, and they eked out of the playoffs. They showed some grit, but that's about it. And I live in an Eagles household, so the house is filled with Eagles fans. The Eagles loss was pretty epic, pretty complete.
It was a part of an end of year collapse.
Part of an end of year, yeah. They went 10-1 and then went 11-6, I guess, in total or something. But so almost squeaked in to playoffs themselves. But so I'm surrounded by Eagles fans. I'm a Steelers fan. But even if those two teams were still in it, which they're not,
right?
I think the Lions. I don't know if it's their year, but I got to pull for them.
Yeah. So, like for me, I grew up suburban Detroit, going to Lions games. The Pontiac Silverdome, did that a lot. Was really into football. Now I've lived in the Dallas area long enough, and people assume, and I always correct them. No, I've never really embraced the Cowboys. Not a Cowboys fan. When I was doing consulting work in Philadelphia, I really emphasized, people, where are you from? Dallas, not a Cowboys fan. like
Just comes out
stammering,
in breath, right?
stammering or not. I had to point that out. They're like, "Oh, thank you." Um, but so being a Lions fan is tough because I turned 50 in October. Before, was it Saturday? No, Sunday.
Sunday.
Sunday, early game Sunday. That was the second playoff game they've won in my lifetime.
Right.
And for people that don't know, the Lions won 3 championships in the 1950s, but that was pre-Super Bowl era. They're one of a handful of teams that have never been in a Super Bowl. And they won one playoff game when I was a freshman in college. And then they lost the next game. And then I think they lost the next 8 playoff games, a lot of one and dones, if they ever had a decent year. And, they went 0-16 one year. But it's a tough existence as a Lions fan. I had kind of gave up on them, or said, especially moving around the country, I'm not going to care about that. When Barry Sanders retired at a pretty young age because he was so frustrated with everything, I kind of gave up on him too. But seeing him on the sideline before the game last night with Eminem and Calvin Johnson, who also retired young, I think out of similar frustration with what they call same old Lions.
Mm-hmm.
All right, if Barry Sanders is back, I'm back. I don't have any other dog in the hunt, so yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to root for the Lions. I'm excited for my Detroit friends, who I know this is exciting for them.
Yeah, and so I lived near Matt Millen, who was president of the Lions through its worst stretch.
And he's hated in Detroit, right?
He hated in Detroit, but when he was president of the Lions, he flew commercial Northwest, right? And I didn't live here then. I would fly out here for other stuff, but he and I would end up on the same plane, seated next to each other several times on a regional jet.
Yeah,
right?
he's a big dude.
Yeah, 78 minutes from Allentown to Detroit. And I'm not a narrow guy, and he's a former all-pro lineman, right? So he and I next to each other in the same row on a regional jet. Those have been some of the most uncomfortable flights ever. But this is when Fire Millen Chance would break out at a University of Michigan basketball game. Like it didn't even have to be football. And they just break out into a Fire Millen Chance. So I felt bad for the guy. So I felt, you got 78 minutes seated next to me where I'm not going to bug you at all.
So you never talked to him?
No, we both, I mean, there were 6 a.m. flights for starters, but no, every time we flew next to each other, it was head down, try to get comfortable, squeeze together and get our way to Detroit. So, all that time I'm just like, this guy probably gets 78 minutes of peace. I'm going to let him have it.
Well, good for him. Good for you. So go Lions.
Go Lions.
But then, boy, it would be quite the year if the Lions, not to get too ahead of things, could win it, because University of Michigan.
University of Michigan, so my wife and I, after both going to Lehigh, both did master's degrees at Michigan. We had season tickets. She's a bigger fan than I am. But we were there when Bianca Batuka ran all over Ohio State and knocked Ohio State out of the national title with Eddie George. So we're the whole family had on maize and blue, definitely happy to see another national title, first since '97. So pretty cool. I already know that the quarterback's moving on, and that young man has fight and perspective. I don't usually spend a lot of time respecting young quarterbacks, but I kind of like his approach to a lot of it.
Yeah, J.J. McCarthy, and he's declared for the NFL draft. The running back Blake Corum has as well. Remains to be seen. This could change between recording and release, if head coach Jim Harbaugh will go back to the NFL or not. But Yeah, I'm happy for Michigan. Growing up between Detroit and Ann Arbor, you pick a school. You're going to be a Wolverines fan or a Michigan State Spartans fan. I picked Michigan. Really cheered for them. Chose Northwestern over Michigan. A lot of my friends from high school went to University of Michigan. I've never had any disdain for U of M the way I do maybe for different reasons some other Big Ten programs. But, I don't know. Jim Harbaugh always kind of bugs me, though.
Well, I mean, not as much as Nick Saban. So it's as we see these coaches retire. I mean, it's hard not to do that without having a massive ego and the annoying factors that come along with it. So I'm not sure. There's a lot of college coaches that come off as endearing.
Yeah. But Nick Saban, who retired and surprised a lot of people by doing that recently after they lost to Michigan in the semifinal. But yeah, Nick Saban, about him, he always talks about process and the process.
He is a systems thinker, and I can't stand the guy. I question his ethics, but his ability to run a system, not on the field, off the field, right? The whole enterprise, the culture, absolutely outstanding.
Now, I have talked to somebody who works at the University of Alabama in an internal continuous improvement role. And they did some sort of event for people internally, and they had Nick Saban as their speaker. And this woman who works there was telling me about it, and I was talking about learning from mistakes. And she had, like, do you have any pull to, have him come on my silly little podcast? And she did check enough. Somebody in the athletic department communications of like, well, clearly you need to wait until after the season. I'm like, well, of course. So I don't know. Now that he's retired, I've kind of reached out. I mean, I'll give it some time. I'm still going to hold out. I'm still going to try again.
Absolutely.
It would be amazing to have him there.
Absolutely knows what he's doing. So nothing, just because he chose the wrong team.
But then, next year, 12 teams in the playoff. Any thoughts on that, or just like, that's
well, at least it's a real playoff, right? There's so much controversy over who makes the top four, that everybody's it's rigged and it's this and it's that. I don't know about any of that. It's how do you pick a top four? There's somebody's going to be left out. But it basically means conference titles mean very little at that point. So at some point it's going to look like hockey playoffs. The regular season doesn't matter at all. Just make the playoffs and then perform. I'm not sure if we really need a Big Ten and an SEC anymore. It's almost you might as well just make the Big Ten, the NFC, and the SEC, the AFC, and all the other conferences that matter. Just divide up and split into those groups, and and then build your playoffs from there. But it'll make the playoffs better. But I still miss the old days of the bowl games. Where all the bowl games mattered.
The final of Michigan versus Washington was a classic Rose Bowl matchup, but now they're both going to be in the Big Ten.
Yep. Yeah. So sports change. I guess we got to roll with it, but I don't know exactly how the schedule's going to work with 12 teams. It's a lot of games to play, but I'm sure it'll be good for money. But it takes a little bit out of the conference side.
Yeah, I think the first round playoff games will be hosted at the college stadiums.
I would assume so. Yeah,
and then they're going to incorporate the bowls. I believe how that's going to work. Yeah.
Yeah, but it'll still limit the bowls and their real impact and meaning. But we've already put the nail in that coffin. So once you had any playoff and a national title, everything else was just for your alumni and for a little TV money. Um, Not quite the same spirit it used to have, but that's sports evolve, and there'll be some good and some bad that comes out of the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, we shall see. So, great talking to you as always. I hope you enjoyed your Knob Creeks.
I did. I as I tend to do. I finished the 9, savoring the 12. So I'll didn't quite finish it, but I'll finish it when we're done.
Well, we have a little bit left in the glass to cheers to.
Absolutely. So,
Good.
Cheers to you.
The sound effect of my glasses clinking. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Siri chimed in. Did you hear that?
I did.
Siri said, "You're welcome." We didn't ask you, but all right. Thanks.
Well,
Thanks for
Siri
listening.
Siri must be drunk.